I was sitting in a coffee shop the other day and watching two mums. They were sisters, quite obviously, and they had four children. And I was watching the interactions that were taking place between these individuals and was frankly quite fascinated with what I was seeing. Here were two moms keenly interested in their children, and four children keenly interested in both their mother and their aunt. What was fascinating is that as the children required something, they went to either adult and sought out information, support, guidance. But when they wanted nurturing, it was quite clear that they first went to their biological mother. Or at least I assume their biological mother, but certainly they looked like they were biological children. The point, of course, is that what I saw taking place is what Dr. William Sears, who's a pediatrician, describes as attachment parenting. Here were parents who were clearly focused on their children, not in a way that they were smothering their children, but rather in a way in which they were supporting their children's emotional needs, the children's exploratory behavior, and at the same time were acting as a secure base by which the children were able to explore their world and know that if something went wrong or they needed some kind of support, they had parents to come back to. Dr. Sears, in his material, talks about how good attachment parenting begins in utero. This is a time when parents start to welcome the child into their life. They begin a relationship with the child during the pregnancy, and they begin the process of saying, this child is now part of our world, and they develop this growing experience with the child. I thought about this again when one of my former students sent me a picture of her baby recently, and here was a child who was so in love with mother and mother so in love with child. But at the same time, here was a child that was being allowed to explore and have her own emotions and her own expressions, and this mother was relishing in that experience. So attachment parenting, the idea that children have a balance between being supported, nurtured, cared, and kept safe by their parents, but at the same time being allowed to explore their world, is a delicate and important balance that allows children to learn how they're going to navigate the world. We've certainly heard an awful lot of conversation lately about free-range parenting. And I think it's a term that probably has way too many meanings and not a lot of science behind it. I suppose when I was a child, I was allowed free-range parenting. I would disappear during the summers on my bicycle and head with my friends down to places that today would be considered probably kind of dangerous. So we were down in ravines and forests and even these sand piles at cement factories. And we would show up for lunch and we would show up for dinner, and frankly our parents weren't all that sure where we were during that period of time. At the same time, it was a much safer world, and so the kinds of concerns that many parents have today, my parents didn't have to worry about. But at the same time, free-range parenting does offer us an interesting perspective in that children who do have an opportunity to explore their world and do so in a way in which they get to be creative in trying to solve the problems of play are often children who transition into adulthood in a more healthy way. They're curious, but at the same time they know that their parents are a source of further exploration. So they're able to come home to mom or dad and sort of say, I saw this today and I'm curious about how that works. So they have the capacity to be creative, to ask their parents about the things that have piqued their curiosity, and at the same time have parents who are interested in the sorts of things that their children have seen. Now, free-range parenting has its negatives. These can be parents who are just neglectful and say, off you go, and show up whenever you happen to show up. The other area that I think is really interesting is the work of Dr. Michael Unger, who has been involved in a resiliency project for quite a number of years. And he's really spoken eloquently and written very extensively about the things that families can do and societies can do to help support resiliency in children. Now, resiliency is important because childhood is not meant to be problem-free. Indeed, children will experience problems both in terms of family relationships because things happen, but also in terms of relationships with peers and as they move into adulthood, relationships with intimacy. But it is resiliency that helps them to manage their way through the difficult times. And so Dr. Unger really has kind of broken it down into two sort of ways. One is the theme of connect with us, and the second is support us. So connect with us is provide role modeling for us, keep us safe, provide neighborhoods and communities that allow us to explore but also be safe. And support us is really about such things as allow us to explore, make sure that our basic needs are met, including food, clothing, shelter, housing, education, but also allow us to make mistakes and help us to overcome the implications of those mistakes, while at the same time experiencing what the mistakes are about. So it's not protect us from mistakes. A form of parenting that we've also been hearing about that's really causing a lot of problems is helicopter parenting. This is the sort of thing where we see that parents aren't really allowing children to grow because these helicopter parents are really making the decisions for the children. They're telling the children what they should feel, what they should do, who they should be connected to, even what kinds of careers we should have. As a faculty member at a post-secondary institution, we come across students who have helicopter parents, and so we have students in our programs that don't really want to be there, but their parents have told them that's the career that they're going to pursue. Well, in fact, the research is now telling us that helicopter parenting doesn't work, and we're starting to see increasing rates of depression and anxiety disorders and an incapacity to maneuver their way into independent adulthood because they just haven't learned how to make their own decisions, including how to make their mistakes and recover from their mistakes. These are all important things that we need to help parents to understand. In the child protection world, we will often see parents who themselves didn't have good role models, and so many of the things that we've just talked about here are things that they don't know how to do. There's some fascinating discussion taking place about one of the things that we can do in child protection is learn how to parent the parent, so that we provide parents the kind of skill development through the lens of being parented to help them to relate to their own children. But at the same time, even good parenting, good enough parenting, and even outstanding parenting, including parenting with attachment, safe, secure attachment, resiliency, the provision of a safe neighborhood, provision of safe environments, connections to safe people, being valued as a human being, even all of those things can be broken by certain kinds of traumatic events that overwhelm the child. I've had the opportunity for many years now to assess teenagers who have developed substance dependence disorders. This has given me an opportunity to not only assess the teenager, but also to meet their families. It mirrors some of the thoughts from Dr. Gabor Mate, who talks about, for example, in his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, the degree to which trauma underlies addiction in so many instances, perhaps even the majority of instances. Certainly in my own work, clinically, I have discovered that trauma is a frequent story that we see as part of the development of addiction. And one of the things that's really struck me in my own research, as well as my clinical work, of meeting families where the parenting's actually been pretty good, where all of the things that we've talked about have been provided, and trauma has entered the life of the child and has overtaken the value or the impact of positive parenting environments. I think of one example of a young woman came from a pretty good family. The parenting was done pretty well. While it wasn't perfect, I'm not sure there is such a thing as perfect parenting, to be entirely honest with you. It was still pretty good parenting. These were parents who cared, provided a safe household, provided a good neighborhood, cared about the idea of family involvement, family connection, created opportunities for support, and at the same time opportunities to make mistakes and recover from mistakes. The kinds of things that the research tells us parents should do. But here was a child who found herself as a teenager in very unfortunate circumstances and was raped on a couple of occasions. She was full of shame. She was full of guilt. She felt somehow she'd made a mistake that had taken her into this environment that allowed her to be raped. And so she became consumed by the shame and by the guilt and began to come off the rails. She would get raped a third time and would at that point dive deeply into addiction. This is an example of how good parenting can be taken off the rails. It's important for us to understand that. So the parents in those cases themselves often don't understand, where did the addiction come from? How did this happen? Because in many cases where good parenting or reasonable family life has been interrupted by this kind of trauma, the parents are taken really from a blindsided position because this has often become a secret within the family for a long period of time. So for many parents, it's a voyage of discovery as well. From a child protection perspective, these are unusual families that we come across because they're not the typical, although I hate to use that term, typical, but they're not the family that so often we think of in a child protection environment where we've had multi-generational disadvantage or strong environmental disadvantage. And so sometimes we tend to dismiss these families as just going through a tough patch because here we really have good families here. But these are families that also come into the child protection system because these children become involved in the criminal justice system. They become homeless, they become run away from home, and they become themselves quite disadvantaged. And we have parents who are very, very much looking for help but don't know where to find it. So there are cases that do belong in the child protection system, but they are cases in which one of the things that it's really important for us to do is find ways to help those families connect to treatment resources as quickly as possible. The thing that makes working with those families perhaps a bit different is that oftentimes they are more resourced and thus more capable of accessing services than many other families that we work with. The challenge, of course, is to not see them as advantaged and see our other clients as disadvantaged, and creating, therefore, two tiers of services for families that come into the child protection system. The problems are just as legitimate. It is understanding the services, needs, and the pathways into those problems that might be different. Our challenge in child protection is to assess the problem, assess the resources needed, and to find ways to connect families to the resources. That's our challenge. This is just one tiny discussion on a complex problem of how addiction exists so significantly within the child protection system. But I wanted to raise it because it does cause us to think about the ways in which what we might think of as good parenting can be hijacked. I'm Dr. Peter Choate, faculty member in social work at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta.